While I was cooking for the family dinner, I heard my cousin say from the next room, "Honestly, I think Uncle Marcus has been lying to us for years about what really happened to Aunt Sarah." My hands froze over the sizzling pan. The onions continued to caramelize, but I couldn't move. Sarah had been gone for 15 years now. A car accident, we were told. A rainy night, a slippery road, and a tragic end to a beautiful life. That's what Uncle Marcus had always said, his voice breaking every time he recounted that awful evening. But now, as I stood in the kitchen with the familiar sounds of our family gathering drifting through the walls, doubt crept in like smoke under a door. My cousin Jamie had always been the skeptical one, the investigator in our family who questioned everything. If she suspected something, there was usually good reason. I turned off the burner and crept closer to the doorway, straining to hear more of their conversation. Through the gap, I could see Jamie sitting across from her brother Mike, her laptop open between them, displaying what looked like old newspaper clippings. "Look at this," Jamie continued, pointing at her screen. "I've been researching for months. The police report from that night doesn't match what Marcus told us. There was no rain that evening, it was clear skies. And Sarah's car? It wasn't found on the highway like he said. It was discovered in the old quarry, 20 miles in the opposite direction from where she was supposedly going." My heart hammered against my ribs. The wooden spoon in my hand felt suddenly heavy, like it might slip from my trembling fingers at any moment. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about that tragic night that had shaped so many of our lives, was crumbling like old paper. Mike leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper I had to strain to catch. You think he had something to do with it?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, sharp and terrifying. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall, my mind racing through memories of Uncle Marcus over the years. His grief had always seemed genuine, his pain raw and real. But now, with Jamie's words echoing in my head, I started remembering other things. The way his story sometimes changed in small details. How he'd grown nervous whenever anyone brought up that night unexpectedly. The insurance money he'd received that had allowed him to buy the lake house where we were gathering today. "I don't know what to think anymore," Jamie replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But we owe it to Sarah to find out the truth. She was like a sister to all of us growing up. If something happened to her, something that wasn't an accident, then we need to know." I closed my eyes, trying to process this revelation. Aunt Sarah had been the heart of our family gatherings, always the one with a kind word and a warm hug for everyone. Her death had left a hole in all our hearts that never quite healed. And now, the possibility that it might not have been the tragic accident we'd mourned all these years made my stomach churn. The sound of footsteps on the front porch made us all freeze. Uncle Marcus was returning from his walk around the lake, the same walk he took every year during our family reunion, claiming he needed the fresh air to remember Sarah properly. Now I wondered if those solitary walks served a different purpose entirely. The front door creaked open and Uncle Marcus's familiar voice called out, "Hope everyone's getting hungry." I worked up quite an appetite on that walk. His tone was cheerful, but I detected something underneath it, a forced quality that I'd never noticed before. I quickly returned to the stove, grabbing the nearest pot and stirring it vigorously to appear busy. My hands were still shaking, and I hoped Marcus wouldn't notice when he inevitably came to the kitchen to check on dinner preparations as he always did. "Smells wonderful in here," he said moments later, appearing in the doorway with that familiar smile that had always seemed so genuine. Now it felt like a mask, and I found myself studying his face for signs of deception. "Sarah always said you had her gift for cooking." The mention of Sarah's name made my breath catch. I managed to nod and mumble something about dinner being ready soon, but my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Marcus lingered for a moment and I could feel his eyes on me, studying my reaction. "You okay, kiddo? You seem a little pale." "Just the heat from the stove," I lied, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. "You know how it gets in here when I'm cooking for the whole family." He nodded and moved on, but I caught something in his expression. A flicker of concern that went beyond worry about my well-being. It was the look of someone who was constantly watching, constantly gauging reactions, constantly managing a narrative. After dinner, while Marcus entertained the younger cousins with his usual stories on the back porch, Jamie cornered me in the kitchen while I was loading the dishwasher. "You heard us talking, didn't you?" she asked quietly, glancing toward the porch to make sure we weren't overheard. I nodded, unable to find my voice for a moment. "Jamie, are you sure about this?" I mean, the police investigated. If there was something suspicious. That's just it, she interrupted, pulling out her phone and showing me a saved web page. I called the detective who worked Sarah's case last week. He's retired now, living in Florida. He told me something that made my blood run cold. I leaned closer to look at the screen, which showed an old photograph of a younger version of the detective standing beside a police car. Detective Morrison said he always had doubts about the case, but the evidence was cleaned up too quickly. By the time he got to the scene the next morning, Sarah's car had already been towed, and the area around the quarry had been disturbed. Someone with connections had made sure the investigation stayed surface level. Connections? I whispered, though I was beginning to understand what she meant. Marcus worked for the county back then, remember? He had relationships with the sheriff's department, the coroner's office, even the local newspaper. If he wanted to control the narrative about what happened that night, he would have known exactly how to do it. The dishes clattered in my hands as the implications sank in. Our beloved Uncle Marcus, the man who had helped raise half of us after our parents died, who had been the steady presence in our family for decades, might be a murderer. And not just any murderer. Someone who had killed his own wife and spent 15 years lying about it to everyone who loved them both. But why? I asked, the question barely audible. Why would he hurt Sarah? They seemed so happy together. Jamie's expression darkened. I've been wondering the same thing. That's why I've been digging deeper into their finances from that time period. Sarah had a life insurance policy worth $500,000. But more importantly, she had just inherited her grandmother's estate, including mineral rights to some land that became very valuable when they discovered natural gas deposits there. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Sarah hadn't just been worth more dead than alive, she had been worth significantly more. And Marcus, with his county connections and his knowledge of how these systems worked, would have known exactly how to make her disappearance look like an accident while ensuring he inherited everything. There's more, Jamie continued, her voice barely a whisper now. I found some old court records. Sarah had filed for divorce 3 weeks before she died. She was going to leave him and she was going to take everything with her. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old lake house seemed amplified. Every shadow looked threatening. I kept thinking about Sarah, about the last time I'd seen her alive at the previous year's family gathering. She had been quieter than usual, I remembered now. Less engaged in the conversations, less enthusiastic about the family games we always played. At the time I'd attributed it to stress from work or maybe just getting older. Now I wondered if she'd been planning her escape, preparing to leave the life she'd built with Marcus and start over somewhere else. Had she been scared? Had she suspected that Marcus might try to stop her? Around 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and crept downstairs to get a glass of water. The house was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of old wood, the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock outside. As I passed the living room, I noticed a light coming from Marcus's study. The door was slightly ajar and I could hear him moving around inside. Curiosity overcoming caution, I approached quietly and peered through the gap. Marcus was standing in front of an open safe I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a painting of the lake. He was holding a manila folder, its contents spread across his desk under the glow of a small lamp. From where I stood, I could make out what looked like legal documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he would hear it, but Marcus seemed absorbed in whatever he was reading. His expression was troubled, almost haunted, and for a moment he looked every one of his 68 years. This wasn't the confident, charming man who told stories on the porch. This was someone carrying the weight of terrible secrets. He picked up one of the photographs and even from my limited vantage point I could see it was a picture of Sarah. Not a family photo but something that looked more official. Possibly a police photo from the scene. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, then pressed it to his chest with both hands, his shoulders shaking with what I realized were silent sobs. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice broken and raw. "I never meant for it to happen that way. You have to believe me." The words hit me like ice water. This was as close to a confession as anyone was likely to get. Marcus had killed his wife and the guilt was eating him alive even after all these years. But sorry or not, he had still done it. He had still let our entire family mourn an innocent victim while he played the grieving widower. I backed away from the door as quietly as possible and returned to my room, but I knew I wouldn't get any sleep that night. By morning I had to decide what to do with this information. Jamie deserved to know what I'd witnessed, but more than that, Sarah deserved justice. Even if it meant destroying the only father figure many of us had ever known. The next morning Marcus seemed different at breakfast. The forced cheerfulness was gone, replaced by something more genuine but also more fragile. He kept looking around the table at all of us. His extended family, the people who loved and trusted him, with an expression that seemed almost like he was memorizing our faces. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, setting down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Maybe it's time I told you all something about the night Sarah died. Something I've never told anyone before." The kitchen fell silent. Jamie and I exchanged glances across the table, both of us holding our breath. Was this it? Was Marcus finally going to confess? "The truth is," he continued, his voice steady despite the tears beginning to form in his eyes, "Sarah wasn't alone in the car that night." The silence that followed Marcus's words was deafening. Everyone at the breakfast table had stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped breathing, it seemed. Jamie's eyes were wide with shock, and I could see her mind racing, trying to process this new information and fit it into the theory she'd been building. "What do you mean she wasn't alone?" Jamie asked quietly, her investigator's instincts taking over despite the emotional weight of the moment. Marcus took a shaky breath and looked out the window toward the lake, as if drawing strength from the familiar view. "There was a man with her. Someone I'd never seen before. When I found the car at the quarry, he was already dead. Sarah was barely conscious, but she was alive." My hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles had gone white. This wasn't the confession I'd expected. This was something else entirely, something that turned everything I thought I knew upside down again. "I don't understand," Mike said, speaking for all of us. "If Sarah was alive when you found her, then how did she?" "She died in my arms," Marcus continued, his voice breaking completely now. "She lived long enough to tell me what happened. The man in the car with her, he wasn't a stranger to her. He was someone she'd been seeing, someone she thought she loved. But that night she'd discovered who he really was." Jamie leaned forward, her laptop forgotten. "Who was he?" "His name was David Chin. He was a private investigator Sarah had hired to look into some discrepancies in our finances. She thought I was hiding money from her, thought I was planning to divorce her and leave her with nothing." Marcus laughed bitterly. "The truth was, I was trying to hide how much debt we were in. I'd made some bad investments, lost most of Sarah's inheritance, and I was too ashamed to tell her." The story he was telling was so different from what we'd imagined, yet somehow it felt true in a way that the perfect accident story never had. Marcus was finally showing us his flaws, his failures, his human weakness instead of the polished grief he'd performed for 15 years. "Sarah found out about the debt anyway," he continued. "But by then she'd also developed feelings for David. She was going to leave me, not because of the money but because she thought she'd found something real with him. That night she was meeting him to tell him she'd filed for divorce." "So what happened?" I asked, finding my voice for the first time since this conversation began. Marcus's face hardened with anger I'd never seen from him before. David Chin wasn't a private investigator. He was a con man who specialized in lonely, wealthy women. He'd done this before, gained their trust, convinced them to leave their husbands, then disappeared with whatever money he could get his hands on. Sarah was just his latest mark. The pieces were falling into place, but not in the way any of us had expected. "She found out," Jamie said, understanding dawning in her voice. "She confronted him in the car. Told him she knew what he was, that she'd discovered the truth about his previous victims. He got angry, lost control. The car went off the road during the struggle." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "When I found them, David was already dead from the impact. Sarah had been thrown clear, but she was badly injured. Internal bleeding." "Why didn't you call for help?" Mike demanded, his voice rising with frustration and confusion. "She might have lived if you'd gotten her to a hospital." "I tried," Marcus shouted back, his composure finally cracking completely. "Don't you think I tried? But we were in the middle of nowhere, and this was before everyone had cell phones. By the time I got back with help, she was already gone." "But the cover-up," Jamie pressed. "Why make it look like an accident? Why not tell the truth?" Marcus slumped in his chair, looking older and more frail than I'd ever seen him. "Because Sarah made me promise not to. In her last moments she begged me not to let the family know how foolish she'd been, how easily she'd been deceived. She was ashamed and she didn't want that to be her legacy. She wanted to be remembered as the woman you all loved, not as the victim of a con man. The kitchen was quiet again, but this time it was the silence of people trying to process a truth that was somehow both better and worse than what they'd feared. Marcus hadn't killed Sarah, but he had lied to us for 15 years. He had carried this burden alone, letting us think he was simply a grieving widower when the truth was so much more complicated. The insurance money? Jamie asked quietly. I donated most of it to charity, Marcus replied. Kept just enough to pay off the debts Sarah didn't know about. Everything else went to organizations that help women escape abusive relationships. I figured it was what she would have wanted. Later that evening, after the rest of the family had absorbed Marcus's revelation and begun the long process of understanding how to move forward, Jamie and I found ourselves alone on the dock. The lake was calm, reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds, and for a moment it was possible to imagine that everything was simple and peaceful. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong with Marcus's story. It explained so much, yet left other questions unanswered. Why had he seemed so nervous all these years? Why the secret walks by the lake? Why had he looked so guilty when I'd seen him with those documents the night before? Jamie, I said carefully, do you believe him? She was quiet for a long time, staring out at the water. I want to, she finally replied. God, I want to believe that's the whole truth. But you know what's bothering me? I waited, knowing she was working through the same doubts that were nagging at me. David Chin, she continued. I've been researching con artists who targeted wealthy women in the 90s. There's no record of anyone by that name fitting that description. No police reports, no victim testimonies, nothing. My stomach dropped. You think Marcus made him up? I think Marcus told us enough truth to make the lie believable. Yes, Sarah was having an affair. I found evidence of that in her old emails, which I finally managed to access through her ancient AOL account. But the man she was seeing wasn't named David Chin, and he wasn't a con artist. Jamie pulled out her phone and showed me a printed email she'd discovered. It was from Sarah to someone named Michael Torres, dated 2 days before her death. The tone was intimate, loving, but also worried. Michael, I can't keep living this double life, the email read. Marcus is getting suspicious, and I'm afraid of what he might do if he finds out about us. He's not the man everyone thinks he is. There's a darkness in him that scares me. I need to get away from here, away from him, before something terrible happens. The words sent chills down my spine. This wasn't the email of a woman who discovered her lover was a con man. This was the email of a woman who was afraid of her husband. There's more, Jamie continued, scrolling to another message. This one's from the day she died. Sarah's final email was short but devastating. He knows. Marcus knows about us. I'm supposed to meet him at the quarry tonight to talk things through, but I don't think he just wants to talk. If something happens to me, please know that I loved you and I'm sorry for the mess I've made of everything. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Marcus had known about the affair. He had lured Sarah to the quarry under the pretense of working things out. And something had gone very wrong that night, but not the way he'd just told us. So where's Michael Torres now? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. That's the most chilling part, Jamie replied. Michael Torres died 3 weeks after Sarah. Single car accident, just like Sarah supposedly had. His car went off a bridge about 50 miles from here. No witnesses, no explanation for why he lost control on a clear, dry night. We sat in stunned silence as the full horror of the situation became clear. Marcus hadn't just killed his wife in a moment of rage. He had systematically eliminated everyone who knew about Sarah's affair and could potentially expose him. Michael Torres had probably been asking questions about Sarah's death, maybe even threatening to go to the police with what he knew. We have to go to the authorities, I whispered. With what? Jamie asked bitterly. 15-year-old emails and a suspicious pattern that any decent lawyer could explain away as coincidence? Marcus has had years to perfect his story and cover his tracks. Tonight was probably just his way of getting ahead of our investigation, giving us enough truth to satisfy our curiosity while hiding the real crimes. As if summoned by our conversation, footsteps sounded on the dock behind us. We turned to see Marcus approaching, his silhouette dark against the lights of the house. In his hand was something that glinted in the starlight. Something metallic and dangerous. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this," he said sadly, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I really hoped the story I told you today would be enough. That you'd let sleeping dogs lie and we could all go on being a family." "Marcus," I started to say, but he held up his hand to stop me. "I heard you two talking. Sound carries across water, you know. Always has. That's how I knew Sarah was planning to leave me all those years ago. I heard her phone conversations from right here on this dock." His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if we were discussing the weather instead of murder. "It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did," he continued, moving closer. "I really did love Sarah. But she was going to destroy everything. Our family, our reputation, our life together. And then Michael started asking questions, making threats. I couldn't let him ruin what I'd built." "What you'd built on lies and murder," Jamie said, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. "What I'd built on love and sacrifice and 30 years of holding this family together." Marcus snapped, his facade finally cracking completely. "Sarah would have left you all behind without a second thought. She would have taken her money and run off with her lover and never looked back. I saved this family from that abandonment." The gun in his hand was fully visible now, pointed not directly at us but ready to be raised at a moment's notice. This was the darkness that Sarah had written about in her emails, the violence that had been lurking beneath Marcus's charming exterior all these years. 2 more accidents, he mused almost to himself. Cousins who came to the lake late at night, maybe had too much to drink, slipped on the wet dock. These old wooden planks can be treacherous in the dark. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. In his arrogance, in his need to explain himself and justify his actions, he had forgotten that sound carries across water in both directions. And Jamie, ever the investigator, had been recording our conversation on her phone from the moment we'd sat down on the dock. The police sirens in the distance grew louder, and Marcus's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to dawning realization. Jamie smiled grimly and held up her phone, showing him the screen that displayed an active call to 911. "You're right about sound carrying across water," she said. The dispatcher heard every word. As the first police boat appeared on the lake, its spotlight cutting through the darkness, Marcus looked at the gun in his hand and then at us. For a moment I thought he might fight, might try to complete what he'd started all those years ago with Sarah. Instead he sat down heavily on the dock, the gun falling from his fingers to clatter on the wooden boards. "I just wanted to keep the family together," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I just wanted us to be happy. But some truths, once revealed, can never be hidden again. And some families, built on foundations of lies and violence, are better off broken than whole." As they led Marcus away in handcuffs, I thought about Sarah and Michael, about justice delayed but not denied. The family gathering was over, but for the first time in 15 years, the real healing could finally begin.